Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, December 3rd. So we're 2 days before Christmas. Something to say about this. From August 29th of 1776 until December 23rd through 25th of that year, the Continental Army of George Washington went from approximately 30,000 plus troops to approximately 3,000. And on the evening of that period of the 23rd, 24th, some people became aware of a scheme by what would be later the President of the United States to launch an assault which was assumed to be impossible across a heavily iced river, though not fully frozen river, which is the Delaware River. That attack would be possible because of a kind of special operations unit called the Marblehead Regiment, also known as the Marblehead Fishermen. They were comprised of over 500 persons altogether, and there's a recently released book about this by Patrick K. O'Donnell. The book is called The Indispensables. And reading to you for a moment from the book jacket, it just indicates the following. The Marblehead Regiment battled at Lexington and on Bunker Hill and formed the elite guard that protected George Washington. At the most crucial time in the war, the special operations-like regiment, against all odds, conveyed 2,400 of Washington's men across the ice-filled Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776, delivering a momentum-shifting surprise attack on Trenton. Later, Marblehead Dr. Nathaniel Bond inoculated the Continental Army against a deadly virus, which changed the course of history. White, black, Hispanic, and Native American, this uniquely diverse group of soldiers set an inclusive standard of unity that the United States Army would not reach again for more than 170 years. So Christmas night, 245 years ago, those who understood the peril with which their cause was beset took an action that changed not only the course of their history, but of all of history, and inspired people, and continues to do that, around the world and to this day. Much of what we have to say and have had to say for some time now, which has involved a kind of confrontation that is happening among certain forces, that being the Russia, NATO, the United States, also China, is bereft of, or apparently bereft of, any relevant context in the arc of history. That's not because it actually is. It's because of the way in which the Jussie Smollett-like falsification of American history and American current history, and of the, if you will, strategic significance of the American Revolution has been tortured. There's a need to return to a clarity about the international character of that revolution in the first place, and about its very specific objective in human history in order to therefore answer the apparent conundrum: how could the nation that was born in that form of struggle and that form of self-effacing sacrifice manage to spend over $2 trillion for 20 years in a place in the world known to everyone as the graveyard of empires, and not understand that its self-interest as a nation was being compromised by and wrecked by that very folly that was being perpetrated not only by its ostensible leadership, but by those that were egging that leadership on to a form of self-destruction. Rather than take that up as a sad, sad commentary on a sad, sad state of events, we don't believe in that. We believe that it's our responsibility both to history as a whole and to the future to take a different approach. Lyndon LaRouche always made the point that the content of policy is the method by which it's made. Often people don't think of any method of policy. They just think about it as a kind of haphazard, grand improvisation, as one author calls it. What we want to do is to present to you tonight in form of just a general discussion, and as we are a couple days now before Christmas, a kind of picture of persons who are taking a different role vis-a-vis the Schiller Institute, and also vis-a-vis intervention in this present circumstance, to take what would otherwise seem to be a tragically doomed and maybe even fatally flawed expression of events too familiar to people who are real students of history, and turn it into exactly what that assault Christmas night of 1776 did. Something unique in human history, something not only positive, but something that set the standard for a kind of Republican intervention, meaning Republican with a small r, that could set history straight and set the course of events straight, and in a pro-human direction. We have a lot of potentials, and there are other events that are going to be happening over the next days, which are momentous. But it's important for us to try to think about these events from a certain arc and a certain standpoint. And so what we're going to do now is to have Mike Billington give us an idea of what that standpoint ought to be, and then we'll get involved in a conversation or a discussion, a little bit less formal than we may have been doing in the past, but nonetheless as fruitful. So, Mike?
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. So what I want to go through is the fact that over the last several weeks, a number of leading foreign policy professionals, intelligence community professionals, some of the leading American diplomatic and intelligence professionals have come to us to do interviews for EIR, the LaRouche Organization, the Schiller Institute. On the one hand, they were doing this because they are insiders, if you will, on American foreign policy and intelligence, who recognize that the nation has gone berserk, that we are approaching rapidly the state of war with nuclear powers, possibly nuclear wars with both Russia and China. And they chose to make that call on our platform. They're saying things like that in other platforms, but they're coming to us, I think, for a second reason, which is that they're sending a message to people who know them, in many cases respect them, in some cases don't like them, but people here in the U.S. and around the world, they're sending a message which says that people have to work with the LaRouche Organization, that we represent a unique institution, a relatively small institution, but one which has forged ties with nations throughout the world, including Russia and China, and key institutions within the U.S. and Europe, which are crucial if we're going to achieve the kind of breakthrough that Dennis was referring to with the crossing of the Delaware, a act at a time of grave danger which changes the entire geometry of world history. Very much like what former Mexican President López Portillo said years ago when he said, "It's time to listen to the wise words of Lyndon LaRouche." So I'm going to review a few of these interviews. This includes not only Americans, but also Chinese Americans, Afghanis. I'll mention several of them. I'll go through some in more depth and some just briefly, but I think it's important to keep in mind that these are high-level professionals from within the institutions in the U.S. and China and Afghanistan who are trying to send a message to the world that they must pay attention and act on this crisis. I think the first and the most important was Ambassador Chaz Freeman. Chaz is perhaps America's top China expert. He speaks fluent Chinese. He was the translator for President Nixon in the famous visit to China in 1972, I believe, which began the process of opening up to China. He then, as a diplomat, became the deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. He later was the ambassador to Saudi Arabia at the time of the first Gulf War in 1990 and 91, and has subsequently established himself as an expert both on Middle East policy, Chinese policy, and to a certain extent, Russian policy as well. So in this interview, I asked him if the policies being taken by the former and current administration, but in particular Secretary of State Blinken's effort to come just short of declaring Taiwan to be an independent nation. And keep in mind that when we opened negotiations to change our recognition from Taiwan to Beijing, the obvious foolishness of pretending that Taiwan was the government of all of China, we recognized that in fact Beijing and the Communist Party of China were the governments of China. And at that time, we acknowledged that this could only be done on the basis of recognizing that there was only one China, that Taiwan was an absolute part of that one China, that they were functioning under one country, two systems, that Taiwan would be allowed to have its autonomous government, but that in the long run, the expectation by the Chinese were that through economic development and the collaboration between Taiwan business and Chinese business, they would eventually reach a point where there could be a peaceful reunification, but that in the meantime, no one attempt to declare Taiwan to be anything other than an integral sovereign part of China. Blinken has been just barely stopping short of declaring that, in fact, they should be treated as a separate part of the country, which the Chinese have repeatedly said, if it becomes impossible for a peaceful reunification, if there is a declaration of independence, then we would have no choice but to defend our sovereign nation militarily. So I asked Chaz in this interview, do you think that we're coming close to the red line in terms of a potential war over Taiwan? He said, we have crossed that red line. And he, of course, was intimately involved in the process of both recognizing China, but then also he was key in drafting the policies towards Taiwan that we would maintain since then. And he said in the interview that we had three pledges that we made at that time. We would end all official relations with Taiwan. We would withdraw all of our military forces from Taiwan, and we would void defense agreements that had been made with Taiwan when we were falsely pretending that they were the government of all of China. And he said, we have broken all three of those pledges. The Chinese are patient. They were willing to wait a long time for peaceful reunification. But if they reach a point where they think that is impossible, they would have no choice but to use military force. And we, in Chaz's view, we have crossed the red line that virtually at any moment the Chinese may have to use military force to reunite their country. And then the question becomes, what would the U.S. do? Is the U.S. going to defend Taiwan militarily if there is a move to reunify through military force? Well, he pointed out that at least 3 times in the past, the U.S. has threatened to use nuclear weapons against China. Once in the Korean War, when the Chinese moved in to force the U.S. back out of North Korea, when we threatened to use nuclear weapons on the Chinese bases. Then in late 1950, 58, when there was a conflict over a couple of small islands in the Taiwan Strait, the U.S. also, actually Daniel Ellsberg recently revealed this publicly, the U.S. at the time was contemplating using nuclear weapons against China at that time. And Chaz says there's a third time he didn't mention. But the question is, would we defend Taiwan? Because back in those old days, China didn't have a nuclear capacity. Now, if we were to choose to defend Taiwan, or claim to be defending, actually helping to separate Taiwan from China, if we were to go to war, we would lose. The U.S. could not defeat China in such a war that far away from the mainland. And then the question became, would we use nuclear weapons? And Chaz made very clear that U.S. policy has been all along that we would fight wars with conventional means, but if we were losing, that we would have the fallback of the first use of nuclear weapons. And as I think all of you probably know, we are sitting in a time with madness in our leadership. The head of our strategic command, Admiral Richards, back in February, openly said that in the past we considered nuclear war to be unlikely, but now with the rise and the aggression of Russia and China, nuclear war is now likely. And we have a leading senator, the second leading Republican in the Armed Services Committee of the Senate, Senator Weicker, who has recently said we should be prepared to mass bomb Russia and their military sites, and we should not take off the table the first use of nuclear weapons. Pure, utter madness. The way Ambassador Freeman put it was, are we really willing to risk losing Chicago by launching a nuclear attack in Taiwan, which, among other things, would mean the total destruction of the Taiwan that we claim to be trying to save and their democracy? So this is where we stand. He says the problem is that U.S. diplomacy is now seen entirely from the perspective of the military, looking through military glasses. He also pointed out on the question of China's supposed aggression in trying to take over the world from the United States. He says the idea that the Belt and Road is somehow an aggressive policy, a debt trap, trying to entrap countries into debt. He says this is absolutely laughable, coming from exactly the institutions which in fact pioneered the so-called debt trap diplomacy, who would loan funds to the developing sector nations, not for developing their economy, not for building infrastructure, not for developing modern industry, but basically foreign aid, which then through the manipulation of their currencies and their raw materials would be able to use that debt to force them to do our will while their country remained backwards. And this is the debt trap that's been used by the Western imperial forces and unfortunately the United States in most cases. And they, as for the Belt and Road, it's quite the opposite. The Chinese, as I'll go into later, discovered that building infrastructure is the way to escape poverty. And they do, in fact, impose debt on countries, but it's to build productive capacity, industry, infrastructure, and so forth, which creates the conditions not only to repay its debt, but to escape from poverty. So Chaz concluded by saying the U.S. is in a state of malaise with economic breakdown, the pandemic breakdown, monopolies of our media and their social media, and that we have a situation where people are basically collapsed their ability to think about what's actually taking place in their name. So this interview was then listened to by a former top CIA official, whose name is Graham Fuller, someone with whom we've had very strong differences in the past and who has refused to participate in our conferences or interviews, saying that, well, you know, people in Washington think LaRouche is crazy. And he watched this interview with Chaz Freeman and said, I have tremendous admiration for Freeman, even though he's not accepted that these days in official Washington, but I tremendously admire this interview, and yes, let's do an interview. So this was most interesting. He is a top Islamic scholar. He trained in Russia and in Russia language and history, Chinese history and language, but especially he's an Islamic scholar. He was the CIA station chief in Kabul in Afghanistan in the 1970s, and was stationed across the Middle East, and is an Islamic scholar. And he said in the interview that the danger we face is that the U.S. became so accustomed after World War II to being the dominating power, the overwhelmingly the greatest economic power, the greatest military power, and that we did many things, many good things, and increasingly many not so good things. But the problem today is that we are no longer the single preeminent overwhelming power economically and militarily, that in fact China, and especially China in collaboration with Russia, has become what he calls the first peer competitor that we've faced in the world, and that the many American people in the inner sanctums of the presidency and the Congress and so forth simply refuse to acknowledge that we are no longer the dominant international power that has the right, or at least has the power, to dictate policy on a global scale. And China, as a peer competitor, will not be dictated to. And they have the absolute right to develop, as any nation would, but especially a nation that either under certain accounting principles is the largest economy in the world, will soon be unquestionably the largest, sometimes double or triple the size of the U.S., and therefore has every right to develop. So he added that, Graham Fuller added, in regard to Afghanistan, where he remains very active, he says we must acknowledge that once again this is a war we did not win. And he said that the reason this horrendous policy of denying them their funds, of cutting off all resources of their own, as well as any kind of aid from the IMF, the World Bank, or from any other country under the threat of sanctions, is pure vengeance. He said this, we've seen this before. He said it's happening in Syria. Why are we still fighting in Syria, even though President Trump demanded that the American troops get out, and they just told them to drop dead? We're still there. We're still killing people. We're still stealing their oil and their food. Why? Because the Assad family, the father and son, who have been the presidents in Syria for a long time, refuse to accept the idea that the U.S. and Israel have the right to dictate all policy in the region. And again, it's vengeance. We're simply out to destroy their population with these Caesar sanctions, which are literally killing people in Syria. So he said this is unfortunately the policy. In terms of the so-called military-industrial complex, he said he has been told by people in the Pentagon that when he says, why do we keep fighting these wars, which we know we're going to lose, and we do lose, and he said he was told, well, we don't care if we win or lose a war, as long as the contracts keep coming, as long as the military-industrial complex and their Wall Street firms that own them keep active, keep building the war machine. It's not important whether we win or lose. Now, that's a rather distorted view, but it's the kind of thinking that's going on. And as an Islamic scholar, I asked him what he thought about Helga's idea of the Project Ibn Sina for the reconstruction of Afghanistan, an international reconstruction, drawing on the name of the great philosopher, poet, and medical genius Ibn Sina from the 11th century, who, and I asked Graham Fuller what he thought of this. He thought this is brilliant. It's, on the one hand, Ibn Sina is beloved across the Islamic world, that his medical work was the standard for centuries after that time. In fact, the hospital in Kabul is called the Ibn Sina Hospital. But he said even more so for the non-Islamic world, it reminds them that there was a golden age of Islam. There was an Islamic Renaissance, a time when the center of world art and culture and science and the collaboration between religions and nations was in Islam. This was subsequently crushed by European imperialism, but he said there's no reason that this could not rise again. About Ibn Sina, I have a quote here. He said, quote, Ibn Sina is a reflection, an aspiration to go back to what made the Muslim world so rich, so strong, so thoughtful, so productive intellectually in its time. He also said something quite interesting, which is that at the time of the invasion of Afghanistan by the U.S. and NATO forces after 9/11, he said this was not really about fighting terror. Having bin Laden as a poster boy made it convenient to launch this attack into Afghanistan. But he said, as he was at the center of U.S. intelligence at that time, he said the purpose was to have a military base on the border of Russia and China, that this was basically taking up the mantle of the British Great Game in the old days when they were battling with Russia over who would dominate Central Asia. So, most interesting. When I asked him about why he had formerly thought differently about LaRouche, he said, well, either I've changed or you've changed. And in fact, you know, he's changed. He's changed as many people are, because they now see that what LaRouche has been warning for 50 years, since Nixon took down the Roosevelt policies and pulled the dollar off of gold, that the nation was losing the American system and increasingly adopting the British model, which would lead to collapse. As Lynn said back in 71, it would lead to pandemics, it would lead to depressions, it would lead to hyperinflation, it would lead to small wars and then possibly big wars. And indeed, here we are. So then, otherwise, we also did an interview with Dr. Shah Murabi. Dr. Murabi is a member of the Afghan Central Bank and has been since 2002 under the occupation forces. But he continues in that position since the Taliban took over. And he has insisted that the Taliban has been willing and in fact acting to work with the central bank and with the institutions that were established during the war and the occupation. And he himself, Dr. Murabi, has led the fight to demand that the U.S. end the sanctions, that they release the $9.5 billion they've sequestered, literally stolen, that belonged to the Afghan people. And he also organized, not only in the media and in organizations like ours, he spoke at a Schiller Institute conference, but he also has organized the Congress. And you probably heard that this past week a letter was released, signed by 46 congressional members of Congress, to the President of the United States, demanding that this money be released, that it be released to the government in Afghanistan, the Taliban government. That and in the interview with us, he made it very clear that emergency aid to deal with the threat of mass starvation and death is urgent, but it's not enough. It won't solve the problem. That what's required is that the institutions some of which were set up during the occupation, be allowed to function so that the country can revive itself and begin to produce again. He particularly pointed to the ugly irony that the reason for not recognizing the Taliban government, or at least working with the Taliban government, is that we are demanding that they show that they're going to have human rights conditions must be met. They must treat women and children in a humane way. So the basis upon which they're making that demand, said Dr. Murabi, is in fact killing women and children in large numbers, and potentially over the winter, as Mr. Beasley, the head of the World Food Program, has said, we're facing possibly 25 million people who are on the brink of famine and starvation because of this evil policy. Then, lastly, I will mention we have not released this interview yet, but over this last week, I did an interview with one of China's greatest and leading economists. And he's not only highly respected in China, where he now heads 3 different institutions at Beijing University as dean of all 3, plus a professor, and is an advisor to the government, but he's very, very well respected internationally. In fact, he was the chief economist at the World Bank between 2008 and 2012. His name is Justin Yifu Lin. And in this interview, he basically said, explicitly said that China is following the policies of Alexander Hamilton. And not only did he say they were following the policies of Alexander Hamilton, which was the idea that the government had an absolute responsibility to direct credit into those things needed for the general welfare of the population, which includes emphatically building the infrastructure that provides the basis upon which industry can grow and prosper, both state industry and private industry. But beyond that, he also said we were explicitly not following the policies of Thomas Jefferson. Now, this is very interesting because most American history does not teach the fact that Jefferson was an advocate. While he wanted independence, he wanted to follow the British model of laissez-faire, free market, free trade, no government intervention. And of course, to Jefferson, this also meant the freedom to trade in slaves, which Hamilton absolutely opposed. There's a long, rich story behind this, which also refutes the cancel culture people here in the United States about the nature of the founding of this country. But Justin Lin is very clear about this, and he made it very clear. Now, this is very interesting, given that we've written many times in Executive Intelligence Review about the work of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who was the leader of the 1911 Republican Revolution that overthrew the monarchy and the empires in China and established a republic. A very difficult time followed that, but nonetheless, it was Dr. Sun, who was educated in Hawaii by followers of Alexander Hamilton, people who were students of the Henry Carey School, and who in his book and his lectures in China, which recruited people to the revolution, the 3 principles of the people, the Sun Min Chui, he very explicitly at length discusses the Hamiltonian model as opposed to the Jeffersonian model. So this is very much alive and well today in China. Justin Lin is one of the authors of several books on the Chinese economy, the Chinese system. So in his interview, he made very clear that the U.S. and China absolutely must cooperate if there's going to be a solution to the global crisis facing the human race today, which are unprecedented crises. And he mentioned in particular the pandemic. He mentioned climate, as people tend to do. They don't. They often try to bypass the issue of the fake science behind the so-called climate crisis. But he mentioned that. But most importantly, he said one of the global crises that we must address is the alleviation of poverty. Remember that the Chinese, for the first time in history, have eliminated abject poverty from their country, lifting 700 to 800 million people out of abject poverty. There's still some poverty, but it's not abject poverty, and they intend to eliminate even the lesser forms of poverty by 2049. The fact is that he said that the U.S. is not collaborating with China, and the reason is that they have lost confidence in themselves, that the U.S. has lost confidence in itself. That very much like what Chaz and Graham Fuller had to say, he said the U.S. Had dominance in the world. They were the largest economy in the world for many, many years, and now that that's not true, that rather than trying to maintain their leadership in science and technology and economy by pouring resources and education into those areas, they're doing it by trying to stop China's rise. That rather than competing in a positive sense in science and technology, they're attacking Chinese firms like Huawei. They're imposing sanctions on Chinese industries. They're denouncing the Belt and Road as almost as military aggression, trying to take over the world, calling it the debt trap, instead of building up their own economy. He then said that when you look at the development of Africa, the way the Belt and Road is going into Africa, he has a totally different way of measuring economic progress, which he calls wealth accounting. He says that in the past, the IMF, the World Bank, and remember, he was chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank from 2008 to 2012. But he said the policy, the so-called Washington Consensus, was what is often called neoliberal orthodoxy, which is really just the British system, free market, free trade, and that after 70 years of foreign aid in Africa, huge amounts of money that went into Africa, but it went in only for aid. It went in to keep people alive and do little things, but they refused to build infrastructure. They refused to build big industrial development type projects. So after 70 years of this, he said, most of these nations, the low and middle income nations, still lack basic necessities, and he named them. They lack health care, they lack energy, they lack clean water. And that this is based on the idea that we look only at money concerns. We look at GDP and we look at debt in measuring a country's productive potential. And this, he says, is inadequate because it's just money. You have to look at the actual physical capacity of a nation to develop, which means you take into consideration the human capital, you take into consideration the natural capital, the resources, but in particular, you look at the potential for infrastructure development. And this, he says, is our method, which he himself calls wealth accounting. I asked him if this non-monetary measure of real progress, how he compares that to the policy of Lyndon LaRouche, which, as most of you know, he calls relative potential population density as a measure basically of the ratios of the way in which scientific discoveries can be translated into the productive process through machine tools and show rates of development from one period to the next through higher levels of technology and the application of that. And he said, yes, we're on the same track. Now, these are different. Lynn's view is in far more advanced, actually, but the point is, by not looking at money, which is, as Lynn always said, is stupid. It has no knowledge of anything. Credit is what actually has a knowledge of what it intends to create. These are creditary appraisals, which are now being used in China, and as Lynn had promoted and proposed for many, many years. So I asked him about Helga's policy of the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites, the idea being that we have to start by building modern health systems in every country, addressing the pandemic. But of course, this therefore also implies, just as he said about these countries, that we have to build not only health capacities, but that requires electricity, clean water, infrastructure, transportation. And he said absolutely, he totally supports this. And also with the project Ibn Sina in Afghanistan, fully supported it. So he was very clear about his consideration about our organization. He said that our institutes, your institute and my institute, must collaborate to get rid of some of these bad ideas. And we have to collaborate on getting these concepts across in order to achieve a world that's based on the idea of peace through development. So I'll stop with that. We have more interviews in the works, and of course we have these projects that have been launched by Helga, and which we have begun to make a series of videos to make these possible. We have reasons to be somewhat optimistic that we've moved the situation away from absolute disaster on the relations with Russia, with some of the discussions that are now planned to go on. The Russians are being quite clear. Mr. Putin today, actually, in a long press conference, made it very clear that we could not be more clear about the fact that if you decide to put your weapons on our border, we are going to act. Just as the Chinese have said, if you continue to think you can simply break up our sovereign nation, we will act. And the question here is, are the leaders in the West so mad that they would actually believe with this kind of hubris that somehow, like Ozymandias in Shelley's poem, that they can simply shout out their commands and the minions will do their bidding? This is not the case in the real world. We have a different reality in the real world, one in which there is an option to this descending, the collapsing dark age closing in on the West. And it has to do with bringing the world together around this higher principle, which is why this relatively small organization is now sitting right at the center of history and the potential for achieving a great good for mankind.